A retired ranger moved into his father's cabin in the mountains. On his first night, a Bigfoot circled his home at 2:17 a.m., leaving a pattern he'd seen before. What it wanted wasn't violence. It was permission. The motion alarm screamed at 11:47 p.m., 3 hours after Evan had finally gotten the generator running. He was still in his work clothes, flannel shirt, jeans stiff with dust from unpacking, when the sound cut through the mountain silence like a chainsaw. For a moment, he just stood there in the half-lit cabin, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, listening to the electronic shriek echo off the pine walls. Raccoons. Had to be raccoons. Evan set down the mug and grabbed the mag light from the kitchen counter, the same one he'd carried for 23 years as a forest ranger. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He'd moved into his father's cabin exactly 6 hours ago, and already the wilderness was reminding him who was in charge. The porch boards creaked under his boots as he stepped outside. October air bit at his face, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine sap and distant snow. He swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, expecting glowing eyes, maybe a overturned trash can. Instead, he found the trees. They'd been arranged in a spiral. Not fallen. Not randomly scattered by wind. Arranged. 12 young pines, each about 6 feet tall, bent at impossible angles and woven together in a clockwise pattern. The spiral started at the edge of his porch, close enough that he could touch the outermost branch, and curved inward toward a center point where the smallest tree had been snapped clean in half and planted upright like a flagpole. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The beam of his flashlight trembled as he moved it across the pattern. Every branch had been stripped of its lower needles. Every trunk showed fresh breaks, the white wood gleaming like exposed bone in the darkness. This wasn't weather damage. This wasn't animals. This was deliberate. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and circled the spiral slowly. No tracks. The dirt around the formation was undisturbed, as if the trees had simply grown this way, twisted by some invisible hand. But Evan had been a ranger long enough to know what humans could do in the woods, and what they couldn't. This wasn't human. His mind raced through possibilities. Kids from town playing a prank, maybe hunters with too much time and too little sense. But the nearest town was 40 minutes down a logging road that most people avoided after dark, and he hadn't seen another vehicle since leaving the highway 3 days ago. The flashlight beam caught something carved into the center tree. Evan moved closer, knees popping as he crouched down. It was a symbol, 3 curved lines radiating from a central point, like a simplified spiral or a child's drawing of wind. The carving was fresh, sap still weeping from the cuts, and it had been made with something sharp but crude. Not a knife, not a saw, claw maybe, or a nail. His stomach dropped. He'd seen this symbol before. The memory hit him like cold water. Himself at 9 years old, sitting at his father's workbench in this very cabin, watching him carve the same design into the handle of his walking staff. Evan had asked what it meant, and his father had just smiled that distant smile he always wore and said, "It's a hello." A hello to what? His father had died 8 months ago. Stroke. Quick and quiet, the way he'd lived. Evan had inherited the cabin along with a dozen unanswered questions and a shed full of journals he hadn't had the courage to open yet. Now, standing in the freezing dark with that symbol staring up at him from broken wood, those questions felt a lot more urgent. A sound stopped him cold. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. Evan killed the flashlight and dropped into a crouch, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd spent 2 decades in the wilderness, tracking everything from black bears to mountain lions, and he knew the sound of something big moving through the forest. This was bigger than anything he'd tracked before. The breathing continued for exactly 30 seconds. He counted, ranger instinct taking over, and then stopped. No footsteps. No rustling branches. Just silence, sudden and absolute, like someone had pressed mute on the entire forest. Evan waited 5 full minutes before he moved. When he finally stood, his legs were shaking. He backed toward the cabin slowly, flashlight still off, eyes scanning the darkness for movement. The spiral of trees looked different now in the starlight. less like vandalism and more like a message. It's a hello. He made it to the porch, hand already reaching for the door, when he saw them. Footprints. Massive, deep impressions in the frost-covered ground, leading from the forest to the spiral and back again. Each print was at least 18 inches long, wider than Evan's boot, with 5 distinct toe marks that pressed deeper into the earth than the heel. Whatever had made them weighed at least 500 pounds. And it had been standing right outside his cabin while he slept. Evan's hand found the doorknob. He stepped inside, locked the door, and stood with his back against the wood, breathing hard. Through the window, he could see the spiral silhouetted against the moonlit forest, branches reaching toward the sky like frozen fingers. His father's journal was in the shed. He'd seen it yesterday while unpacking, a leather-bound book locked inside a metal box with a note taped to the lid. For Evan, when you're ready. He wasn't ready yesterday. Tonight, he didn't have a choice. Evan crossed the cabin, pulled on his jacket, and grabbed the spare key from the kitchen drawer. The shed was 50 feet from the back door. A short walk he'd made 100 times as a kid. Tonight, it felt like miles. The metal box opened with a rusty click. Inside, his father's journal waited, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Evan lifted it out, and a photograph fell onto the floor. His father, younger, standing in front of this cabin with his walking staff in one hand. Behind him, barely visible in the tree line, was a shadow. Tall, impossibly tall, and it was watching the camera. Evan didn't sleep that first night. He sat at his father's desk with the journal open, reading by lamplight while his coffee went cold. The entries started simple: weather patterns, wildlife sightings, notes about forest trails, normal ranger observations. But on page 17, dated March 1997, the tone changed. It returned last night. Same time, 2:17 a.m. I heard it circle the cabin 3 times before stopping at the eastern window. No question. Just checking. I left venison at the tree line like before. By morning, it was gone. In its place, the spiral, made fresh. Evan's eyes burned as he flipped through pages. More entries, more spirals, more food exchanged. His father had been feeding something in these woods for over a decade, and whatever it was, it followed a pattern. Always 2:17 a.m., always circling, always leaving the spiral as a response. The last entry was dated February 14th, 6 days before his father's stroke. Getting old. Hands shake too much to carve anymore. Evan will come eventually. He'll understand when he's ready. The crossing must be protected. They remember kindness. They remember violence even longer. Evan closed the journal as dawn broke through the windows. By noon, he'd convinced himself it was all superstition. His father had been alone too long, seeing patterns where there were none. The spiral was probably teenagers from town. The footprints were bear tracks, distorted by frost. By sunset, he'd stopped believing his own lies. He spent the evening reinforcing the cabin, checking locks, oiling door hinges, making sure every window latched properly. Not because he felt threatened, but because the weight of being watched was suffocating. Something knew he was here. Something was waiting. At 2 a.m., Evan lay in bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. At 2:17 a.m. exactly, the footsteps began. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to vibrate through the cabin floor. Thud, thud, thud. They started at the front porch, moving along the eastern wall, the same route his father had described. Evan's breath came in short gasps as he listened to something massive circle his home, pausing at each window for exactly 10 seconds before moving on. Not running, not hunting, inspecting. The steps completed one full circle, then stopped at the porch. Evan forced himself out of bed, legs trembling, and crept to the window. He pulled back the curtain an inch, just enough to see. The spiral had grown. New branches had been added since yesterday, positioned with surgical precision in the gaps he'd noticed before. They formed a secondary ring, tighter and more complex, with small stones placed at regular intervals like punctuation marks. This wasn't random. This was communication. And standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the starlight, was a shape. Tall at least 8 feet. Broad shoulders tapering to a narrower waist. Arms hanging past its knees. And completely, utterly still. Evan's heart stopped. The shape turned its head just slightly and looked directly at his window. For 3 seconds, they stared at each other across 40 feet of moonlit ground. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, each step silent despite its size, disappearing into the darkness like smoke. Evan stood frozen at the window for 20 minutes before his legs remembered how to move. The next morning, he drove into town and bought 6 trail cameras, 200 feet of battery cable, and enough SD cards to record a month of footage. The hardware store clerk, a weathered man named Dutch with logger's hands, rang up the purchase without comment until Evan asked for motion sensor lights. "You setting up at the old Mercer place?" Dutch asked, eyes sharp. "My father's cabin." "Yeah." Dutch stopped scanning items. "Your daddy was Isaiah Mercer?" "Yes, sir." A long pause. Dutch glanced at the other customers, a young couple buying paint, then leaned across the counter. "He kept those woods quiet for a long time," Dutch said softly. "Kept folks from going where they shouldn't. You planning to do the same?" Evan's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean." "Yeah, you do." Dutch bagged the cameras slowly. "You got that same look he had. That I've seen something look." He pushed the bag across the counter. "Advice? Don't go poking around after dark. And if you see the spiral, don't touch it. That's their language, not ours." "There." But Dutch had already turned away, helping the couple with paint colors like the conversation had never happened. Evan drove back up the mountain with more questions than answers. That night, he mounted all 6 cameras in a perimeter around the cabin, angles overlapping for complete coverage. At 2:17 a.m., every single one of them triggered at once. Evan bolted upright in bed, heart already racing before his mind caught up. The monitoring tablet lit up like a Christmas tree, 6 red alerts blinking simultaneously across the screen. Every camera, every angle, all triggered within the same second. Impossible. Unless something had circled the entire cabin in one coordinated movement. Or unless there was more than one. His hands shook as he grabbed the tablet, pulling up the live feeds. For screens showed empty forest, branches swaying slightly in night wind. The 5th showed static, gray snow flickering across the display like the camera had been knocked offline. The 6th showed the back fence line. And standing there, perfectly centered in the frame, was the creature. Evan stopped breathing. It wasn't blurry. There was no convenient fog, no technical glitch to hide behind. The camera's night vision rendered everything in sharp green and white clarity. The wooden fence posts, the frost on the grass, and 8 feet of solid, impossible reality. Dark fur covered its entire body, thick and shaggy across the shoulders, shorter on the face. The head was conical, slightly domed, with a pronounced brow ridge that cast shadows over deep-set eyes. Its arms hung past its knees, ending in hands. Not paws, hands with long, articulated fingers that gripped the top fence rail. It wasn't moving, just standing there, studying the cabin. Studying him. Evan's ranger training kicked in automatically. Estimate weight, 600 pounds minimum. Assess behavior, non-aggressive, curious. Look for signs of aggression, ears forward, no teeth showing, relaxed posture. This was an animal conducting reconnaissance. No, not an animal. The way it held itself, the deliberate patience in its stance. This was intelligence. The creature tilted its head, and for one horrible, wonderful moment, Evan could see its face clearly. The eyes caught the camera's infrared light and reflected it back. Bright white circles in the darkness, focused directly on the lens. It knew the camera was there. It wanted to be seen. Evan's finger hovered over the screen, frozen between zooming in and closing the feed entirely. 23 years as a ranger, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. He'd tracked grizzlies through Yellowstone, tagged wolves in Alaska, spent weeks alone in the backcountry with nothing but a radio and a can of bear spray. None of it compared to watching this thing look into his camera with what could only be called consideration. The creature released the fence rail and took one step back. Then another. moving with a fluidity that shouldn't be possible for something that size, each footfall placed deliberately, weight distributed perfectly, barely disturbing the frost-covered ground. It reached the tree line and paused. Evan watched, transfixed, as it raised one massive hand and pointed. Not at the cabin, not at the camera, but at something off-screen to the left. Toward the spiral. Then it turned and walked into the forest, disappearing between two cedars that looked too close together to allow passage. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable. The next, gone. Evan sat in the dark for 30 seconds, tablet screen glowing in his lap, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Then he did something he'd never done in 2 decades of field work. He called the sheriff's office and immediately hung up before it could ring. What would he say? "I've got Bigfoot on camera?" They'd laugh him out of the county. Or worse, they'd come investigate, bring media, turn his father's quiet refuge into a circus. No, his father had kept this secret for 14 years. There had to be a reason. Evan pulled up the recorded footage and played it again. And again. And again. Each time, the same details. The deliberate approach, the careful inspection, the pointed gesture toward the spiral. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a ritual. His father's journal lay open on the nightstand. Evan grabbed it and flipped to a middle section, finding an entry from July 2003. It brought the young one tonight. Smaller, maybe 6 feet tall, staying back in the trees while the elder checked the perimeter. This is the 3rd generation I've seen. They're teaching it the route, showing it which humans are safe. We're not predators to them. We're landmarks. Signposts on a path they've walked for longer than we've been here. A migration route. That's what Dutch had meant by the crossing. This wasn't the creature's home. It was a highway, and his father had been the toll collector, making sure nobody set up roadblocks. Evan looked at the tablet again. The creature's face filled the screen, frozen in perfect clarity. He'd spent his entire career in the wilderness, dedicated his life to understanding nature's patterns, and nature had just knocked on his door and asked to be let through. The only question now was whether he'd answer. Evan made it 3 days before he cracked. 3 days of watching that footage on loop, memorizing every detail. 3 days of the 2:17 a.m. visits, always punctual, always following the same route. 3 days of finding new additions to the spiral each morning. Stones arranged in nested circles, stripped bark woven between branches. Once a perfect ring of pine cones placed around the center tree. Each addition felt like a question he couldn't answer. On the 4th day, he drove back to town. The hardware store was quieter this time. Just Dutch behind the counter, reorganizing socket wrenches with the careful attention of a man avoiding boredom. He looked up as Evan entered, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite fear. More like resignation. "Back already?" Dutch said. "Camera's working out." "They're working fine." Evan set a bag of batteries on the counter. "Maybe too fine." Dutch's hands stopped moving. "That's so. I need to know what my father was protecting." "Then you should ask your father. He's dead." "I'm aware." Dutch rang up the batteries slowly, each beep of the scanner deliberate. Isaiah was a good man, kept his business to himself, respected the mountain. That's all you need to know. Evan leaned against the counter. "Someone's been coming onto the property every night, building patterns with trees and stones. My father's journal says he fed them. Called it the crossing, you know what that means. I saw it in your face last week." Dutch's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the store's back office, then lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "You got footage?" Evan nodded. "And you planning to show anyone? Post it online? Call the news?" "No." Dutch studied him for a long moment, measuring something Evan couldn't identify. Finally, he sighed and came around the counter, flipping the store's sign to closed, despite it being only 2 in the afternoon. "Back room," he said. "And you didn't hear this from me." The office was cramped. Filing cabinets, a desk drowning in invoices, walls covered with old logging photographs. Dutch pulled 2 folding chairs from behind the door and sat down heavily. "Your daddy ever tell you about the winter of '93? Evan shook his head. "Group of hunters came through in January. 5 of them, down from Seattle, equipped like they were going to war. Had thermal scopes, bear traps, tranquilizer rifles, the works. Said they were tracking elk, but everyone knew what they were really after. Dutch pulled out a battered photo album from his desk drawer, flipping to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The photograph showed 7 men standing in front of the hardware store, all smiling. Dutch pointed to 3 faces. These 3 never came home. Evan's stomach tightened. What happened? They went up past your daddy's property, into the high ridges where the old growth still stands. Set up camp near Devil's Canyon, that narrow pass where the cliff walls come together. Your father warned them, told them those woods weren't for hunting. They laughed at him, called him a superstitious old fool. Dutch closed the album. Search and rescue found their camp 2 weeks later. Tents shredded. Equipment scattered over half a mile. 1 rifle bent in half, bent, not broken, and left in the middle of their fire pit. But no blood. No bodies. No sign of violence except the fear. They died. No. Dutch looked up, and his eyes were hard. They walked out 3 days later, half frozen, babbling about watchers in the trees and roads that weren't for people, packed up and left town that same day. Never filed a report. Never spoke about it again. Evan felt cold despite the stuffy office. And my father? Your father went up there right after the rescue team left. Stayed in those woods for 2 days. When he came back, he told me something I'll never forget. Dutch leaned forward. He said, "They're not animals, Dutch. They're not monsters. They're stewards. And we've been walking through their garden without permission for 100 years. Stewards of what?" The crossing. Dutch stood up, moving to a wall map of the county. He traced a line with his finger from the Canadian border down through the Cascades. There's a migration route that runs through these mountains, old as the trees themselves. Your daddy figured it out somehow. The creatures that use it, they've been here longer than we have. Longer than the towns, longer than the logging roads. And they remember. Remember what? Who respects the path? And who doesn't? Dutch turned back to Evan. Your father earned their trust somehow. Kept hunters out, kept developers away, maintained the boundary. That's why they came to his cabin. That's why they're coming to yours now. Evan's mouth went dry. They're testing me. No, Dutch said quietly. They're asking you. Same question they asked your father 30 years ago. Are you going to protect the crossing? Or are you going to break it? Evan spent the drive back up the mountain replaying Dutch's words. They're asking you. The cabin felt different when he pulled up, less like a refuge and more like a checkpoint. The spiral sat undisturbed on the porch, branches now dried and brittle from days in the open air. He'd been so focused on the creature itself that he'd barely looked at what it was actually building. Now, with Dutch's story fresh in his mind, Evan crouched down and studied it properly. The pattern wasn't random. The outer ring spiraled clockwise, but the inner additions curved counterclockwise, creating a double helix of bent wood and stone. At specific intervals, every third branch, someone had tied small bundles of dried moss using what looked like stripped cedar bark. This wasn't decoration. This was precision. Evan pulled out his phone and photographed it from 6 angles, then opened his father's journal to the sketches in the back pages. There, page 43, the same double spiral, drawn in careful detail with annotations in his father's tight handwriting. Outer ring equals boundary acknowledgement. Inner ring equals safe passage granted. Moss bundles equals seasons passed in peace. Count them to know how long the agreement has held. Evan counted the moss bundles in the spiral on his porch. 14 years. The exact length of time his father had been feeding whatever walked these woods. His hands trembled as he flipped through more sketches. His father had documented everything. Different spiral variations, stone arrangements that meant waiting versus warning. Even a series of drawings showing how to leave food offerings without causing offense. The last sketch stopped him cold. It showed the cabin from above, with lines radiating outward into the forest like spokes on a wheel. Each line was labeled with a year and a direction. But one line, heading northeast toward the high ridges, was marked in red ink. Primary route. Do not block. Canyon passage critical for winter migration. Devil's Canyon, where the hunters had gone in '93. Evan looked up at the tree line, following the angle his father had drawn. If the map was accurate, the main migration path ran within a quarter-mile of the cabin, through the densest part of the old-growth forest, up to the narrow canyon pass Dutch had mentioned. He needed to see it for himself. The shed held more than just his father's journal. Buried under tarps and old camping gear, Evan found a backpack already loaded. First aid kit, emergency beacon, water purification tablets, and his father's walking staff, the one with the spiral carved into its handle. Evan shouldered the pack and grabbed the staff. Felt right in his hand, balanced and worn smooth by decades of use. The forest was silent as he followed the northeastern line, using his ranger training to navigate by sun position and landmark trees. His father's map had been precise, every fallen log, every distinctive boulder exactly where the sketch indicated. After 40 minutes of steady climbing, the trees changed. The pines grew taller here, old-growth specimens that had survived logging by pure geography, too remote to be worth the effort. Their trunks were massive, some 10 feet across, bark thick and deeply furrowed. Evan recognized the ecosystem immediately. This was Climax Forest, undisturbed for centuries. And running through it, barely visible beneath fallen needles, was a path. Not a human trail. The width was wrong, at least 4 feet across, and the vegetation was compressed rather than cut. Saplings grew right up to the edge but never crossed it, as if some invisible boundary kept them back. Evan knelt and brushed away pine needles, revealing dirt packed hard as concrete from countless years of heavy footfalls. He placed his hand flat against it and felt the slight depression, the way the earth remembered weight. How many generations? He wondered. How many creatures have walked this exact line? The path led upward, winding between the ancient trees toward a rock face visible through the canopy. Evan followed it for another 20 minutes until the forest opened into a natural clearing. At the center stood a massive Douglas fir, at least 500 years old. It had been split vertically down the middle, both halves still alive but separated by a 2-foot gap. The wood inside had been hollowed out, not rotted, carved, and lined with river stones that fit together like puzzle pieces. Moss covered everything in thick emerald blankets, and inside the hollow, arranged on a flat stone shelf, were offerings. Old ones, a rusted pocket knife, 3 glass bottles empty but intact, a leather pouch containing dried jerky so old it had fossilized, a child's toy truck, paint long faded, and at the back, carefully placed on a bed of fresh cedar boughs, a photograph in a waterproof sleeve. Evan picked it up with shaking hands. It showed his father, younger, maybe 50, standing in this exact clearing with his arm around a woman Evan barely remembered. His mother, who died when he was 6. Behind them, barely visible in the gap between the split tree, was a shadow. Tall. Watching. In the photograph's bottom corner, his father had written in silver pen, "They attended Sarah's funeral, stood at the tree line while we buried her. They understand grief." Evan's vision blurred. His father hadn't just been protecting a migration route. He'd been part of something deeper, a relationship built on mutual respect, on shared loss, on the fundamental understanding that some boundaries matter precisely because both sides choose to honor them. A branch snapped behind him. Evan turned slowly, still holding the photograph. At the clearing's edge, partially obscured by shadow, stood the creature from his camera. And it wasn't alone. Evan froze, every muscle locked in place. The larger creature, the one from the footage, stood directly ahead, maybe 30 feet away. But to its left, half hidden behind a cedar trunk, was a smaller one. 6 feet tall instead of 8, slimmer build, with lighter brown fur that caught the filtered sunlight. The young one his father had written about, or its descendant. Neither moved, neither made a sound. They simply watched him with the same patient intensity he'd seen on the camera feed. Evan's grip tightened on his father's walking staff. Slowly, deliberately, he held it up so the carved spiral was visible, the way you'd show identification at a checkpoint. The larger creature's head tilted slightly. Its eyes, deep brown, startlingly human, moved from the staff to Evan's face and back again. Recognition. Then it did something that stopped Evan's heart. It raised one massive hand and traced a spiral pattern in the air between them. 3 curved lines radiating from a center point. The same symbol. The same greeting. It's a hello. Evan's breath came out in a shudder. He lowered the staff and, not knowing what else to do, pressed his fist to his chest and bowed his head slightly. A gesture of respect he'd learned years ago from a Yakama elder. When he looked up, both creatures had taken a step back. Not retreating, making space. The larger one gestured toward the split tree, then toward Evan, then back to the forest. The meaning was clear. You understand. You may go. Evan backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on them, staff held loosely in one hand. The creatures remained still as statues until he reached the trail, then melted into the forest without a sound. He ran back to the cabin, legs burning, lungs screaming, his father's photograph clutched against his chest. That night, Evan didn't sleep at all. He sat on the porch with the journal, reading every entry twice, understanding now what his father had truly been protecting. This wasn't about wildlife conservation or environmental stewardship. This was about coexistence with something science refused to acknowledge. At 2:17 a.m., the footsteps came as expected. But this time, Evan opened the door. The creature stood at the edge of the porch light's reach, massive and utterly still. Up close, its face was less ape-like than the cryptid shows suggested, the features more refined, the expression more complex. Intelligence lived behind those eyes. Consciousness. Evan set a canvas bag on the porch, dried venison, apples, smoked salmon he'd bought in town. The same offerings his father's journal described. The creature looked at the bag, then at Evan. Something passed between them, not words, not even understanding exactly, but acknowledgement. Contract renewed. It took the bag gently, turned, and disappeared into the darkness. Evan went back inside and finally slept. He woke to the sound of engines. Not the distant rumble of logging trucks on the valley highway, but the aggressive snarl of ATVs coming up his father's private road. Evan stumbled to the window and saw them. 2 vehicles, heavily modified with roll cages and LED light bars, tearing through the forest like they owned it. Trophy hunters. His stomach dropped. The ATVs stopped 50 yards from the cabin, and 2 men climbed out, both wearing tactical gear, both carrying rifles that were definitely not for deer. One had a drone controller strapped to his chest. The other was setting up what looked like a thermal camera on a tripod. Evan grabbed his jacket and stormed outside. "This is private property," he shouted over the engine noise. The one with the drone looked up, grinning. Mid-30s, expensive gear, the kind of smile that said money solved every problem. "Relax, buddy. We're not here for you. I don't care what you're here for. Turn around and—" "We tracked it here," the other one interrupted. He was older, harder looking, with scars on his hands that suggested military background. 2 weeks of drone footage, thermal patterns, the whole 9 yards. There's something big living in these woods. Really big. And we're going to be the ones who prove it. There's nothing here but bears and elk. Bullshit. The younger one held up a tablet showing heat signature footage. A massive bipedal form moving through trees. "We've got 6-figure offers from 3 different networks for verifiable proof. Dead or alive doesn't matter. That thing's worth more than this entire mountain." Evan's blood ran cold. "You can't." A rifle crack split the air. The older hunter had fired a warning shot at the tree line, the sound echoing off the ridges like thunder. "Come on out," he yelled toward the forest. "We know you're there. We've been tracking you for days." Silence. Then, from 6 different directions simultaneously, came a sound Evan had never heard before. A low, resonant call that vibrated in his chest cavity. Not aggressive, not fearful, coordinated. The younger hunter's face went pale. "What the hell was that?" "That," Evan said quietly, "was you making the biggest mistake of your life." The calls stopped as abruptly as they'd started, leaving only the tick of cooling ATV engines and the hammering of Evan's heart. The older hunter, Evan heard the younger one call him Cole, lowered his rifle slowly, scanning the tree line with the careful precision of someone who'd been in bad situations before. "Marcus, pack the thermal camera. Now!" But we just... Now. Something in Cole's voice made even Evan's skin prickle. This wasn't a man who scared easily, and he was scared. Marcus fumbled with the tripod, hands shaking as he tried to collapse the legs. It's just wildlife, right? Some kind of territorial call? That wasn't wildlife. Cole backed toward his ATV, rifle still up. That was coordination. Whatever's out there. There's more than one, and they just surrounded us. Evan stepped forward. You need to leave. Right now. Follow the logging road back to the highway and don't stop. Cole's eyes snapped to him. You know what's out here. I know you just threatened something that's been walking these mountains since before your grandfather was born. And I know if you don't leave immediately, you won't get another chance. Is that a threat? No, Evan said quietly. It's a guarantee. Marcus had the camera packed. He was already on his ATV, engine running. Cole, man, forget the footage. Let's just go. But Cole's jaw was set in that stubborn line Evan recognized from every trophy hunter he'd ever encountered. Men who measured their worth in things they'd killed. Who couldn't stand the idea of prey that got away. We've got 50 grand in equipment here, Cole said. 2 weeks of tracking. I'm not leaving because of some sounds in the forest. He raised his rifle and fired 3 more shots into the canopy, deliberate, spaced out, a challenge. The forest absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. See, Cole said. Nothing out there but... The bait trap exploded. Evan hadn't even noticed it. A reinforced steel cage they'd set up near the tree line, baited with rotting meat. One moment it was intact. The next, something had struck it with enough force to tear the metal frame apart like aluminum foil. The pieces landed 30 feet away. Marcus screamed and gunned his ATV, fishtailing down the road in a spray of dirt and pine needles. Cole stood frozen, rifle half-raised, staring at the demolished trap. That's not possible. That thing was rated for grizzlies. Nothing could. Movement at the porch caught Evan's eye. The canvas bag he'd left last night sat exactly where the creature had placed it after taking the food. Except now, next to it, was the destroyed bait trap's meat. Carefully arranged in the spiral pattern, placed like an offering. Or a message. We don't need your poison. We have what we need. Jesus Christ, colhe Vispered. Evan grabbed his father's walking staff from where he'd leaned it against the cabin. Last chance. Leave, or I stop being polite about it. But Cole was already moving, backing toward his ATV with the jerky movements of a man whose worldview had just shattered. He climbed on, nearly dropped the rifle, caught it, and looked back at Evan with wild eyes. What the hell are you protecting? The path, Evan said. Same as my father. Cole gunned the engine and disappeared down the mountain. Evan waited until the sound faded completely before he moved. His hands were shaking so badly he had to set the staff down. They'd come back. Men like Cole always came back with more people, better weapons, news crews in tow. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Unless he finished it now. Evan grabbed his pack and followed the northeastern trail at a dead run. His lungs burned as he climbed, feet finding purchase on roots and stones purely from muscle memory. The path was clear in daylight, worn into the earth by centuries of use, impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. He found the hunters 20 minutes later. They'd made it as far as the canyon approach before stopping or being stopped. Both ATVs were parked sideways across the trail, engines still running, but Cole and Marcus stood 50 feet back, pressed against a rock wall with their rifles on the ground. Because the creatures had come. Not one. Not two. 7 of them stood in a semicircle across the trail, blocking the canyon passage. Different sizes, from the young one Evan had seen to a massive elder that had to be 9 feet tall. None moved. None made sound. They simply stood there, a living wall of fur and muscle and ancient patience. Cole's face was sheet white. They won't let us pass. We tried going around, and more appeared. They're hurting us. Evan stepped forward, staff in hand, and every creature's eyes locked onto him simultaneously. The elder, the largest one, tilted its head in that now familiar gesture of recognition. Evan raised the staff, showing the carved spiral. Then he did something his father's journal had never explicitly described, but that he understood instinctively. He knelt down and traced the spiral pattern in the dirt with his finger. 3 curved lines radiating from a center point. These humans are leaving. They won't return. The path is safe. The elder watched him complete the pattern. Then it stepped aside. One by one, the others moved with it, opening a corridor through their ranks. Not toward the canyon, but back down the mountain, toward the highway. Toward exile. Go, Evan said to the hunters. And if you ever come back, they won't give you another chance. Cole and Marcus didn't need to be told twice. The hunters' engines faded into silence, swallowed by the mountain. Evan remained kneeling in the dirt, spiral complete at his feet, while 7 pairs of eyes watched him from the tree line. His heart hammered against his ribs. Not from fear anymore, but from the weight of what he'd just done. He'd chosen a side. His father's side. The side that said some things mattered more than proof, more than profit, more than mankind's endless need to conquer and catalog everything it touched. The elder creature stepped forward, closing the distance to 10 feet. Up close, its face was ancient. Deep lines around the eyes, gray threading through the dark fur on its jaw. This wasn't just an animal. This was a person in every way that mattered. Someone who'd walked this path for decades, maybe longer, watching humans come and go like mayflies. It lowered itself into a crouch, not submissive but deliberate, bringing its eyes level with Evan's. Then it reached out one massive hand and touched the spiral he'd drawn. Its finger traced the pattern slowly, almost reverently, before it looked up at Evan and placed that same hand over its chest. Thank you. Evan's throat tightened. He mirrored the gesture, fist over his heart, and bowed his head. When he looked up, all 7 creatures were melting back into the forest, their forms dissolving into shadow and green until he couldn't tell where fur ended and foliage began. The elder was the last to go. Paused at the tree line, turned back once, and then was gone. Evan spent the next 3 days systematically dismantling every trace of human intrusion. He found Cole and Marcus's trail cameras mounted in trees along the migration route, 12 in total, all recording to cloud storage. He destroyed every one, smashed the SD cards, and buried the pieces in separate locations across the property. He hiked to the old bait sites and removed the remaining traps, hauling 90 pounds of steel and cable down the mountain on his back until his shoulders screamed. He called the county surveyor and filed paperwork to have his father's property designated as a wildlife conservation easement, permanently protected from development. The lawyer handling the estate asked why. Evan just said it was what his father would have wanted. In the evenings, he sat on the porch and read the journal cover to cover, learning his father's language. How to read weather patterns in the way branches were arranged. How to tell the difference between a greeting spiral and a warning. How to leave offerings that honored rather than insulted. On the 7th night, at 2:17 a.m., Evan was ready. He'd built his own spiral on the porch. Not a copy of the one he'd found that first night, but something new. He'd woven in elements from his father's sketches. The double helix pattern, the moss bundles, and at the center, a carving he'd spent hours perfecting on a flat river stone. The spiral symbol with 2 figures inside it. One tall, one human-sized, guardian and protected, both walking the same path. The footsteps came right on schedule. Evan opened the door and stepped outside. No flashlight this time, trusting his eyes to adjust to the starlight. The elder stood at the edge of the porch, exactly where it always did. But tonight it wasn't alone. The young one stood beside it, smaller and uncertain, taking half steps forward and back like a child meeting a stranger for the first time. Evan's breath caught. This was what his father had described, the passing of knowledge, one generation teaching the next which humans could be trusted. He knelt slowly and placed both hands on the spiral he'd built. Then he looked up at the elder and waited. The elder studied him for a long moment. Then it placed one hand on the young one's shoulder and guided it forward. The young creature approached hesitantly, eyes wide, until it stood at the opposite edge of the spiral. It looked at the carving Evan had made, then at Evan himself. Evan stayed perfectly still, letting it look, letting it decide. Finally, the young one reached out and touched the stone carving. just one finger gentle as a whisper. It traced the two figures, the guardian and the protected, and something like understanding crossed its face. Then it did something that made Evan's eyes burn. It picked up a small pine cone from the porch and placed it carefully inside the spiral, adding its own piece to the pattern. I see you. I understand. The elder made a low sound, approval, maybe, or satisfaction. It stepped forward and lifted the carved stone from the center of Evan's spiral. For a moment, Evan thought it was rejecting the offering. Instead, the elder walked to the porch column where Isaiah Mercer's old walking staff had left deep grooves from years of leaning. It set the stone there, in the exact spot where Isaiah had always placed his staff, marking the location as significant. Then it drew something from the thick fur of its chest. A stone, smaller than Evan's, worn smooth by handling. The spiral was carved so deeply into its surface that even in starlight, the lines were visible. The elder placed it in Evan's hands. It was warm, impossibly warm, like it had been kept close to living skin for years, because it had. This was the stone his father had been given, the mark of a recognized guardian. Now it was Evan's. The elder pressed its fist to its chest, the gesture Evan had learned, and bowed its head. Evan returned it, tears streaming down his face. When he looked up, both creatures were walking toward the tree line. The young one looked back twice, curiosity overcoming caution, before the elder guided it into the darkness. Evan sat on the porch until dawn, the stone warm in his hands, watching the forest his father had protected. The spiral sat between him and the trees, a bridge between worlds. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Evan understood why his father had never left. This wasn't exile. This wasn't loneliness. This was purpose. The path would be walked again. The seasons would turn. The creatures would migrate through these mountains as they had for centuries, trusting that at this one small cabin, there lived a human who understood that some boundaries existed not to divide, but to connect. Evan closed his eyes and felt the mountain breathe around him. He was home.